In 1966, a band introduced the world to a character so mysterious, her name alone sparked curiosity and speculation. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why did she captivate the imagination of millions? This haunting string-laden track from a seminal album wasn't just a song. It was the beginning of a musical enigma. Did the writer make up the name, or did he steal it from a gravestone? And who wrote this song, really? The most famous songwriting duo ever got into a nasty argument about it through the press. The story, really interesting, coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. Today we're solving a great mystery. You know, if you remember when ding-dongs were wrapped in tinfoil, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now and click the bell, the big red button, so you never miss an episode. That one came from Alan Gray, one of our viewers. Also, the t-shirt of the day, Ozzy and Randy Rhoads. Man, you got to get it below at 80stees.com, or you can get it right up here at the link. Click on our link to get or choose from thousands of the coolest shirts out there. And this one in particular, you gotta have it. Also, check out more of our stuff on Patreon. So it's time for another episode of our program, The New Standards. Paul McCartney's imagination has brought us so many great characters in popular song, but his greatest character has to be Eleanor Rigby from Revolver, the brilliant seventh studio album by the Beatles.
Eleanor Rigby.
But was Eleanor Rigby a real person? We're going to find out the answer to that mystery. Let's go ahead. In October 2021, in a piece for The New Yorker, Paul McCartney shared the heartfelt inspiration behind Eleanor Rigby. He revealed that it came from an old woman who lived alone, someone he'd come to know quite well. Paul would often run errands for her and then sit in her kitchen listening to her stories while the faint hum of her crystal radio filled the room. He said, "Just hearing her stories enriched my soul. Those moments had a lasting impact and influenced the songs I would later write." When Paul McCartney first started crafting what would become Eleanor Rigby, his protagonist wasn't Eleanor at all. It was actually Miss Daisy Hawkins. In 1966, Paul shared the origins of the song with Sunday Times journalist Hunter Davies. He revealed how the idea first took shape. He said, "The first few bars just came to me. And I got this name in my head, Daisy Hawkins, picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. I don't know why, but I couldn't think of much more, so I just set it aside for a day."
Picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been.
Now, a short time later, the story started to evolve. The name Father McCartney popped into Paul's head, along with the line, "All the Lonely People." Paul continued, "But I worried people might think that was about my dad, sitting there knitting his socks or something. Dad's a happy lad, so that wouldn't do." That's what he said. Determined to find a better fit, Paul turned to the phone book of all places, and he stumbled across the name Mackenzie, and the haunting tale of loneliness started to take shape.
They all belong. Father Mackenzie.
Now, the name Eleanor Rigby, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It came together piece by piece from Paul McCartney's life. The first half of Eleanor may have been inspired by Eleanor Braun, as an actress who starred alongside the Beatles in their 1965 film Help.
The ring. She's not wearing the sacrificial ring.
The last name, Rigby, that had a completely different origin. Actually, in January 1966, Paul visited his girlfriend at the time, actress Jane Asher. She was performing at the Bristol Old Vic in The Happiest Days of Your Life. While strolling around the city, he noticed a shop called Rigby and Evans Limited. Something about the name, it just caught his attention and it stuck with him. Years later, Paul reflected on the choice in the song. He said, "I just liked the name. I was looking for something that sounded natural. And Eleanor Rigby, it fit." With that, the unforgettable name of one of the most mesmerizing songs ever was born.
Eleanor Rigby.
Sir Paul McCartney first crafted the melody for Eleanor Rigby while he was just tinkering around on his piano. According to Donovan, he even heard Paul play an early version on the guitar. Back then, the character had a very different name, Ola Natungi. At this stage, the song carried hints of Indian musical influence, and its lyrics were far from the final version. Lines like blowing his mind in the dark and a pipe full of clay suggested a nod to drug use, giving the song a much edgier tone before its transformation into the haunting classic that we all know today.
Where do they all come from?
Now, once he had the foundation, he shared the song with the Beatles during a gathering in the music room at John Lennon's Kenwood home. As Paul played it through, everyone in the room was hearing it: John, George, Ringo, and John's childhood friend, Pete Shotton. They started offering their takes, their opinion, their input. George Harrison suggested the now iconic hook, "Ah, look at all the lonely people." That came from George. And then Ringo Starr contributed the vivid line, "writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear." He even pitched the idea of having Father McCartney darn his socks, and Paul loved it.
Writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear.
It was Shotton who pointed out that naming the priest Father McCartney might lead listeners to, connect it, that it might be, Paul's father. And that gentle nudge led Paul to make the change that gave birth to the now famous Father Mackenzie from the phone book. But Paul McCartney struggled with how to end Eleanor Rigby, until Pete Shotton offered a pretty poignant idea. The two lonely characters, Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie, should cross paths too late, with Father Mackenzie conducting her funeral. Brilliant idea. John Lennon initially dismissed the suggestion outright, though, but Paul stayed quiet, later adopting the idea and acknowledging Shotton's contribution to the song.
Wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave.
Now, according to Lennon, the finishing touches on the lyrics came together in the recording studio. There, Paul sought input from Neil Aspinall and also Mel Evans, the Beatles' trusted road managers, to refine the song into the masterpiece that it has become. Although credited to the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, Eleanor Rigby is one of the rare songs where John Lennon and Paul McCartney later disagreed over who deserved the primary writing credit. Again, they shared the writing credit, so I don't know what the big deal was, but of course there was always McCartney songs and Lennon songs, right? Musicologist Walter Everett believes that the lyrics for Eleanor Rigby were likely a collaborative effort among the group, the whole group. However, historian Aaron Torkelson Weber points out the most available accounts credit Paul McCartney as the song's principal author. I might add the only significant contradiction comes from John Lennon's post-1970 recollections. In the early 70s, John Lennon opened up to music journalist Alan Smith, and he admitted that he'd written about 70% of the lyrics to Eleanor Rigby. Lennon wasn't shy about airing his grievances. In a fiery letter to Melody Maker, I actually took aim at Beatles producer George Martin, firing back at his recent comments in an interview. John claimed that half of the lyrics had come from his own pen, written both in the studio and at Paul's place. Interesting. By 1980, though, Lennon's memories seemed to have shifted. Reflecting on the song, he confidently stated that he had written nearly everything except for the first verse. But those closest to him, they had their own takes. Of course, Lennon's longtime friend Peter Shotton, we've talked about, suggested that his contribution to the song was virtually nil, while Paul McCartney saw it differently. In that same interview in 1980, Lennon didn't hold back his frustration with Paul. He resented the way that Paul had gone behind his back, seeking input from their bandmates and friends instead of working directly with him. Lennon called it the kind of insensitivity that would later deeply upset him.
Donning his socks in the night when there's nobody there.
Now, beyond the personal sting, music critic Weber speculates that Lennon's bitterness might have been fueled by the song's success. As years passed after the Beatles split, John Lennon seemed determined to position himself as the true musical genius, especially in contrast to McCartney's fame. Looking back, McCartney would later point to In My Life and Eleanor Rigby as the two Lennon-McCartney collaborations where they couldn't quite agree on who did what exactly. Their differing memories reflect just how complicated and really intertwined their songwriting process was.
In my life, I've loved them all.
In the eyes of music critic Everett, McCartney's portrayal of Rigby and Mackenzie it takes their individual loneliness and wasted lives and turns them into something universally relatable to all, much like John Lennon's Nowhere Man.
All his nowhere plans is for nobody.
Everett also points out that McCartney's imagery, it's both vivid and familiar enough to make us feel deep compassion for these lost souls. That's certainly the effect that Eleanor Rigby has had on me through time. But its lasting resonance is remarkable considering that the song didn't come from a profound or traumatic incident. Paul McCartney said it just came. He explained that as soon as he started working on the melody, the lyrics started to flow naturally. It all kicked off with the line, "I wonder if there are girls called Eleanor Rigby." Interesting.
Where do they all come from?
Now, at first, McCartney didn't know exactly what the song would be about. But once he came up with the line, "picks up the rice in a church where a wedding has been," that's when the story of a lonely older woman started to take shape exactly. The line, "wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door," brilliant. That was a reference to the cold cream that she uses to try to look younger. On the podcast, McCartney Life and the Lyrics, Paul actually shared a memory that's always stuck with him. He said, "My mom's favorite was Nivea. I still love it to this day," speaking of the cold cream. He also admitted it kind of frightened him. He was always a bit unsettled by how much cold cream women seemed to use. He said, "I remember thinking when I got older and married that I'd end up with someone who'd do the same, putting on one of those big shower caps and curlers surrounded by all these beauty products." It made quite an impression on him, and that's where the line came from, the face in the jar. It's just jukebox poetry. Perfect.
Wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door.
So getting more into the story, Eleanor Rigby tells the story of two lonely souls. First, we meet Eleanor Rigby, a woman who attends church and is found cleaning up rice after the wedding. The second verse brings in Father Mackenzie, the pastor whose sermons no one will hear. This suggests that either no one is coming to his church or that his words just aren't reaching anyone on a deeper, more spiritual level. And the final verse, Eleanor passes away in the church and Father Mackenzie is the one who buries her.
Died in the church and was buried along with her name.
And I think it's just a brilliant touch. After Eleanor is buried, we learn that no one was saved. No one was saved, implying that her soul didn't find the salvation promised by the church.
No one was saved, all alone people.
Eleanor Rigby definitely constituted another step in the Beatles' evolution, shifting them from a rock and roll and pop band to this experimental studio-driven group. You know, with George Martin's arrangement of a double-string quartet and lyrics that told a story about loneliness, this song broke away from the norms of popular music, both in the sound and in its theme. The track, it was a departure from the usual pop sound that the Beatles were known for. The band didn't play any instruments on this song, though Lennon and Harrison added some harmony vocals. But much like their earlier hit Yesterday, the song featured a classical string ensemble.
Oh, yesterday came suddenly.
This time it was a full octet of studio musicians, 4 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos, playing a score written by George Martin. And get this, George Martin's inspiration for the arrangement came from a really unexpected source, the work of composer Bernard Herrmann, and his haunting score for the 1960 film Psycho.
Night when there's nobody there. What does he care?
Now, it was a bold move, turning a Beatles track into something completely different from what anyone would have expected from them, but that was the Beatles for those years, right? When it came time to record Eleanor Rigby, McCartney was determined not to repeat what he had done with Yesterday, though. He didn't want the strings to feel too, sugary or too sentimental. Instead, the arrangement kept things more subtle. The instruments were arranged to double up, meaning, 2 instruments played each of the 4 parts of a string quartet that created that full, huge sound. To capture a raw, more immediate tone, microphones were placed unusually close to the instruments. This did not sit well with the string players. And they were actually quick to tell engineer Jeff Emmerich, "You're not supposed to do that," worried that the close miking would expose any flaws in their playing.
Lonely people.
As they moved their chairs farther away from the microphones, George Martin got pissed. He had to step in. Over the talkback system, he said, "Stop moving the chairs."
All alone people.
Revolver, featuring Eleanor Rigby, was the Beatles' last recording project before they stepped away from live performances. It really marked a turning point in their music. It was definitely the most ambitious use of studio technology up until that point, taking everything they'd learned from their previous album, Rubber Soul, and pushing it even further. And of course, they'd push it even further with Sgt. Pepper. The result, of course, was a groundbreaking record that has since been held as one of the most innovative and influential albums in the history of popular music. I mean, critics and fans alike have celebrated Revolver for its bold range of musical styles and its experimental sounds and its thought-provoking lyrics, solidifying its place as a true landmark recording.
It is not dying.
In his book Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll, Robert Rodriguez notes that while Lennon had been the Beatles' primary creative force up until Revolver, McCartney had now risen to a nearly equal standing with him. It's a great book. You got to pick it up. I'll link to it below. With Revolver, they didn't just push musical boundaries. I mean, they reinvented the very sounds that they were creating. The album was a playground of innovation, with the band making extensive use of compression, and tonal equalization. It crafted a sonic landscape unlike anything anyone had ever heard. Jeff Emmerich, the band's trusted engineer, recalled how the Beatles, they encouraged the studio team to throw out traditional recording techniques. He said it was implanted when we started Revolver, that every instrument should sound unlike itself. A piano really shouldn't sound like a piano, and a guitar shouldn't sound like a guitar. I mean, this mindset turned the recording studio into a laboratory. This is where the Beatles treated every sound as a chance to break free from convention and explore new auditory territories. This band had poured in an incredible 220 hours of recording into Revolver. I mean, that's a staggering figure when compared to the less than 80 hours that they spent on Rubber Soul. This effort was immense, but it showed in the final product. Now, this album was officially completed on June 22nd with the final mix locked in. Paul had his share of frustration when it came to his vocal performance in Eleanor Rigby, though. After listening back to the recording, he just wasn't satisfied with what he had done, and at one point, he almost gave up on it entirely. Actually, in a June 2010 interview with Q Magazine, he admitted that after recording the song, he just felt he could have done it better. He said, "I remember not liking the vocal on Eleanor Rigby. I just thought I hadn't nailed it. Yet with time and distance, I came to appreciate the final take." He said, "I listen to it now and it's very good, but it's a bit annoying when you do Eleanor Rigby and you're just not happy with it." Eleanor Rigby was actually released as part of a double A-side single from Revolver paired with Yellow Submarine. This was in August of 1966. What a time in music.
We all live in a yellow submarine.
I think for 3 or 4 months there, that was the greatest 3 or 4 months in popular music history. Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
Everybody must get stoned. God only knows what I'd be without you.
When Revolver hit shelves in the United States, its release perfectly coincided with the Beatles' final tour, like I said. But the excitement surrounding the album, it was unfortunately overshadowed by a storm of controversy. John Lennon had recently sparked outrage with his now infamous comments that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. The backlash was immediate. Of course, in the American South, most of all, where radio stations refused to play the Beatles' music. Fans even gathered to burn their records in public protests. So in light of this uproar, Capitol Records became wary of any religious references in the band's song. They had a knee-jerk reaction to it, so they decided to push Yellow Submarine as the lead side of the double A-side single rather than Eleanor Rigby. Actually, the band's press conference in the middle of the tour on August 11th saw tensions flare again. This is when a reporter suggested that Father McKenzie's unheard sermons in Eleanor Rigby somehow symbolized the decline of religion in society. But Paul McCartney, ever the calm diplomat, quickly clarified, this song was not a commentary on religion. It was about loneliness. One of the characters just happened to be a priest. In 1966 and 1967, Eleanor Rigby blasted the #1 in several countries, though, including Australia, Belgium, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK.
But do they all belong?
However, in the United States, the single peaked at a more modest number 11, missing the top 10. Surprisingly modest outcome for a Beatles song in America, especially one as great as Eleanor Rigby. The song's inability to crack the top 10 in the States is really likely linked to the backlash from John Lennon's controversial statements, though. However, for the most part, Eleanor Rigby managed to avoid the brunt of the controversy, perhaps due to its gentle lilting string section, which made it more palatable for listeners. As discussed, Paul McCartney once explained that the name Eleanor Rigby came from a mix of actress Eleanor Braun's name in a store in Bristol, Rigby and Evans Limited Wine and Spirit Shippers. He later confessed that he might have subconsciously been inspired by the name on a gravestone that he had seen. She was a real person. Check this out. Now, the details of the Eleanor Rigby in the song are purely fictional, according to McCartney. But the real Eleanor Rigby, according to the gravestone inscription, and also census records I looked up, she was born in 1895 to Mary Rigby and Arthur Whitfield. She worked at a hospital in Liverpool and was married to Thomas Woods in 1930. Eleanor lived in Woolton her entire life, and she passed away at just 44 years of age in 1939. In 2017, the deeds for the Rigby family's grave plot were auctioned off, along with an 1899 miniature Bible inscribed with Eleanor's name. In a separate lot, the original handwritten score for McCartney's song was sold. At the time, McCartney reiterated that his creation of Eleanor Rigby was purely imaginative and not connected to the real person. Now get this, this is interesting. In 2008, another fascinating piece of history surfaced that also suggested Paul McCartney might have had an unexpected source for the name Eleanor Rigby. So the story begins in the early 90s. A woman named Annie Mawson was teaching music to children with learning difficulties. Now, among her students was a severely autistic boy who, with Annie's patient guidance, learned to play Yellow Submarine on his piano. His achievement earned him a Duke of Edinburgh Silver Award, a moment of triumph for both him and Annie. Now, touched by the joy that McCartney's music had brought, Annie wrote to the former Beatle to share the news. So months later, she received a mysterious brown envelope stamped with a Paul McCartney World Tour logo. Inside, there was no letter, just a single page from an old account log kept by the Corporation of Liverpool. The log recorded the wages of a scullery maid who had worked at the Liverpool City Hospital in 1911 and whose name, written in the ledger, was E. Rigby. Annie was struck by this discovery. She later recalled in an interview, "When I saw the name Rigby, I realized why I'd been sent it. I feel that when you're holding it, you're holding a bit of history. It was as if the mystery of Eleanor Rigby had come full circle, linking McCartney's creation to a real person from Liverpool's past." When the ledger slip went up for auction later that year, Paul, he was a good sport about it. He addressed the situation with a lighthearted remark to the Associated Press. He said, and I quote, "Eleanor Rigby is a totally fictitious character that I made up. Now, if someone wants to spend money buying a document to prove a fictitious character exists, that's fine with me."
Do they all belong?
I love it. What an interesting story. Do you think Eleanor Rigby was a real person? What are your memories of the song? Let's have a great discussion below about Eleanor Rigby, one of the Beatles' best songs. I think it's top 10 Beatles. What do you think? What do you think, Paul McCartney and John Lennon? What do you think about that rivalry about who wrote the song? I think it was pretty obviously Paul McCartney. Sounds more Paul than John. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.